Hello, my name is Andrew White, and I'm a fellow in management practice here at Side Business School at the University of Oxford. I'd like to offer you a very warm welcome to this event today, where we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the business school and also looking forward to what the future of business might look like, the future of leadership, the future of organizations. We're going to be exploring the concepts of doubt and trust, and I have with me to discuss that Rachel Botsman, who's a trust fellow in the business school, and Michael Smets, who studies leadership and organization. So welcome to the both of you. If I could kick off, Michael, with really a question for you. Why doubt? Where has it come from? This is a word that I think historically didn't sit alongside our conceptions of leadership, which were about strength and about knowing what was going to go on and making decisions. And yet we've seen this word creep into the lexicon of language around leadership. And in many ways, it's almost doubled in its importance over the last few years. So if you could kick us off, why doubt, why now?
I think why now is almost obvious. Sadly, again, as kind of history has pulled the rug of certainty from under our feet. But of course, doubt is not new. Ironically, when you think about it, when we published the CEO report in which we first outlined the concept of the power of doubt, that was in 2014-15. And many people today ask me, well, isn't it time to kind of do a second edition of the report? And I think back to what was the world like when we asked those 150 CEOs back then, what does it take to lead a global corporation in the 21st century? Now, if we recall, the world was in great turmoil at the time because there was this new deathly virus, Ebola. At the same time, energy prices were in great turbulence, and Russia had just annexed Crimea. Now, fast forward to 2022, and you might think the world hasn't changed that much. It has in some way, because as you say, when we asked CEOs back in 2014, do you ever doubt yourself? It was to our huge surprise that a large majority of them said yes. And not only did they admit to doubting themselves, but they celebrated it. They said words like, a level of professional doubt should be the quality of any good leader. And if you don't doubt yourself in a professional, positive way, you're borderline dangerous for your company. That was certainly a big surprise back then. Now, again, think about the past 2 years, think about COVID. How often have we seen corporate and public leaders face the cameras, face the public, and have to say, we don't know? So in a way, there is now a much greater acceptance of leaders doubting, of leaders acknowledging that they're human and that they're not omniscient. And so there is definitely a far greater acceptance of leaders who doubt themselves. And I think personally that also really has an important and profound impact on the level that we trust others. I'll just share a quick anecdote from one of my executive classrooms, which really brought home this link between doubt and trust for me. Because many leaders are still a bit skeptical whether it's okay to acknowledge and admit doubt and vulnerability in public with their teams. And especially those that know that they may operate in more kind of typically male-dominated, kind of masculine, testosterone-driven environments. And so it's always really interesting when someone from one of these environments speaks up and it's like, it's quite different. And so I had this question, and the person who put up their hand was a former Navy SEAL. And his argument was, if you cannot authentically articulate your doubts to me, if you cannot clearly tell me what you know and what you think you know, what you can do and what you can't do, if you can't articulate those doubts, how do you expect me to trust you in the battlefield? And that, I think, is really where we need to think about this link between doubt and trust.
So, Michael, thank you. You've given us a great start in terms of really helping us understand why doubt, why now. Rachel, if I could go to you, we've also seen the emergence of the importance of trust. And you've really been a global pioneer in helping us understand trust and why trust is important. So could you kind of dovetail into this conversation with your view on trust and why that is also a cornerstone or a really important pillar of leadership today? Rachel, you're muted.
Hang on.
Yeah, you're on. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all good. So I was going to say that maybe I should start by just sharing my own relationship, my own journey into really questioning the narrative around the relationship between doubt and trust. I was sitting in a conference about to give a talk, and I don't know why, but often right before me, there is often some guru that is giving some kind of lecture on self-confidence. And it was yet another talk that was saying how we shouldn't have self-doubt, that doubt was the thing that got in the way of us achieving things in the world, and that we should all rid ourselves of self-doubt. And I couldn't quite articulate why, but this narrative that I was hearing was making me feel extremely uncomfortable. So while I was sitting there, I'm really fascinated by language, and I looked up the root meaning of the word doubt, which in Latin comes from hesitation. And I thought this was really interesting, that this idea of hesitation was seen as a negative. So let me explain how I see this connected to trust and why these two things are so powerful when you transform your lens on them. So the way I define trust is that trust is a confident relationship with the unknown. Trust is a confident relationship with the unknown. And there are all different kinds of trust. So you can have trust in systems, you can have trust in institutions, you can have trust in other people, interpersonal trust, and then you can have trust in yourself. But the definition stays the same. So if you think about trust in other people, a confident relationship with the unknown, when you trust them, you don't need to know what they're up to. You can empower them, you can give them a lot of autonomy. When you think about trust in yourself, the ability to trust yourself is the capability to sit in the unknown. It's the capability as a leader, as a parent, as a partner, as a friend, as a colleague. It's the capability to sit with uncertainty, to be okay not knowing how things are going to turn out, to be okay saying the words, I don't know, I'm not sure, I was wrong. All these things require a high level of self-trust. And what is interesting is what I've seen in my research is that people who are capable sitting with the unknown, they almost embrace that friction that exists in the word doubt, the root meaning being hesitation. Efficiency, logic, and certainty can actually be the enemies of trust. When everything is so smooth and there is no friction, it doesn't allow that deep form trust to form. So the way I see doubt is it allows us to have that friction, to sit in the unknown. And that's the place of discovery. You know, you look at scientists, you look at inventors, you look at entrepreneurs. They have a very high capacity to sit with doubt because they have high self-trust. They're capable of living with that uncertainty.
So thank you both for kicking off with such a good start. And I think it really showcases the school and what the school's about in really trying to understand the most important issues in the world today around leadership and how leaders can address 21st century challenges. The third pillar to our discussions is going to be you, the audience, and you're already flashing up on my screen here. So I want to welcome people from the US, from Canada, from Spain, from South Africa, from Egypt, from Indonesia, from Saudi Arabia, from London. Where else? That's probably a good spectrum. So please do bring your questions in. We're a global school and we're interested in how these ideas resonate in different countries, in different cultures, perhaps even in your own language, how some of these words show up and how they're used and have meaning. So what I take from both of you in terms of your understanding of these words is this is about an internal thing. It's about internal work that I have to do on myself as a leader to look at how I think, how I make decisions, how I understand the world, how I understand myself, how I understand my emotions, how I use my emotions. So, Michael, if I could come back to you, you're in the classroom with executives every week. You're talking to these leaders. Have you seen a change in how they go about? Has it become about the internal as well as the external, about the results they deliver, and also about the internal way in which they develop?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think part of the work that we do with those executives, and where some of these eureka moments happen, is the notion that doubt doesn't have to be so internal. That's where it starts. It's a deep-seated emotion, how we feel about those kind of high stakes, high uncertainty decisions that we're tasked with as leaders. But again, what is really critical is that we build these support networks, that we build teams around us that can help us through these moments of doubt. Now, that is very helpful on the one hand, but also quite tricky at the moment, especially in a world where we are socially remote, where we go into hybrid working. We can simply no longer take for granted that the person who can unlock us in these moments of doubts just happens to be on the other side of the corridor, or we bump into them at the coffee machine. But we need to be much, much more deliberate in curating those conversations that help us move forward. And the problem there traditionally has been that in moments of doubt and vulnerability, when things get a little bit heavier and darker around us, we have a go-to person. We often go to people we like. The problem with that is that people we like, chances are they are like us. So in a moment of doubt, when actually what we need is some challenge and some inspiration and a bit of a shake-up, they're more likely to validate, which in situations might actually result in false validation. So what is really important here is helping people to understand, what is it about the particular situation I find myself in right now that makes me doubt? Why am I doubting myself? Why am I doubting this decision right here, right now? And that helps you to understand, what's the kind of conversation I need to have, and who can provide this conversation for me. So the whole point is that we actually take doubt out of the individual. We take it out of this internal dialogue, this internal tension or friction, as Rachel called it, and say, well, how can we hand over one of these voices to somebody else and have a genuine conversation, rather than internalizing all of this doubt within ourselves? So it is deeply internal, but it doesn't have to be.
So what I'm hearing from you, Michael, is that it's about listening to those voices inside that are telling you that our current way of working, or our current strategies, or our products, or our technology is no longer going to deliver the results that we're looking for example. And then how do I create a space for us to have that conversation? And there's a phrase that you and I have been wrestling with or talking about, which is this conscious disconnection from the status quo. How do we move away from what we know, and how do we curate spaces where we can, in a sense, turn down the power of some of those biases, or turn down the power of some of those certainties that we've got? So, Rachel, if I could come to you, you are talking about trust to thousands of people a year. You're seeing this concept resonate. How are you seeing people take it forward, and how are you seeing them change as a result of having a better understanding of trust and its role in terms of how leaders operate?
Yeah, I think doubt is still a very loaded word. I think people are sort of coming around to the word of humility. But maybe before I talk about that, I just want to touch on something that Michael said, because I think it's really important. When you start to see doubt as friction is energy. So what you do with that energy is really important. So I think one of the reasons why doubt has so many negative connotations is that if you internalize that energy, and it becomes that downward spiral where you don't know what to do with these doubts, that can become very paralyzing. So it's about, how do you take that friction? How do you take that energy and use it to drive things forward, use it to disrupt things, use it to have a conversation that you wouldn't normally have. So I've always found that really helpful, to think of doubt as friction. But if you internalize that energy or over internalize it, it can lead to a downward cycle. Now, the challenge is, if you think about a lot of corporate environments and large organizations, they are not set up to really cope with that friction, even to nurture that friction, because the way meetings are run, everything is often very linear. Everything is very much grounded in the world of logic and certainty. This is often at the sort of core of corporate cultures. If you look at KPIs and the way people are measured. So this question of how do you create a space for friction where doubt can really flourish, and creativity and relationships and strengthening teams can all emerge from that, is a really, really big question. That's the question you asked me, Andrew. I think there is still a lot of fear around this word doubt, because it's seen as a weakness. So as a leader, particularly during times of uncertainty, isn't your role to project confidence? Isn't your role to provide people with assurance that you know where we're going and that you have the answers and you have the information? Well, yes and no, because as Michael said at the beginning, we've seen in the pandemic, and politicians have fallen into this trap, that if you try to project a false certainty, if you try and say, yeah, I have the answer to that, when nobody knows, it really damages trust. So that's been the shift, is that there is this delicate balance between overconfidence and a type of confidence that gives people reassurance. And Adam Grant wrote a fantastic book on this called Think Again. And what he's seen in his research is that when leaders, once they've established their capability, so once people believe, yes, this leader has the experience, they have the skills, they have the resources to do the job. If that leader stands in front of an organization and they're asked a question, and they say with humility, you know what? I don't have the information to give you the right answer, or I can't possibly predict that. When they do go back to that team, when they do go back to that organization and they do give an answer, people trust them more. So this ability to say, I don't know, I'm not sure, I don't have the information to give you an answer now, this is really the rocket fuel behind humility. And humility in leaders, what we're seeing, is like a superpower when it comes to trust, after you've established your capability. So once people believe that you can do the job and that you're capable, a leader that demonstrates humility often earns trust quicker than an overconfident leader over time.
So if I could ask you both the next question. Over the last 2 years, pretty much all of us have changed the way we work. I'm sitting at home. I think, Michael, judging by your background, you're in the office. Rachel, I think you're at home. We've all got, various bits of kit and various spaces we've had to carve out of our homes to put computers. And I've got like lights and cameras that you can't see here that, I never thought I would have in my house before the pandemic. And what I'm hearing is people wrestling with, how much do we go back into the office? Whose choice is that? Is that the choice of the organization? Is that a right for me to work from home? We've heard some banks say everybody has to go back in 5 days. We've heard from other organizations, they're saying it's 2 or 3 days in the middle. So how are these issues playing out in this new hybrid working environment? And do we need to be together to form trust? Do we need to be together to hold that space for doubt that both of you are talking about? And are we limited by this, I suppose, fragmentation of not being in physical proximity to each other the way we were? So Michael, do you want to take a shot first at that?
I'll take it first. And I also spotted on the Ched Rahadi's question on how the interaction platforms that we use now, Zoom, Teams, etc., influence whether and how we doubt. And just as you described it, Andrew, I mean, I'm sitting here with a spotlight in my face and a camera targeted on me. And when we talk about how we create safe spaces where we can productively and authentically doubt ourselves, I like to use the metaphor of backstage and front stage, like in a theater. In the backstage, we create practice spaces where we can rehearse, where we can make mistakes. So we genuinely have greater confidence in our performance once we stay onto the front stage. But now our backstage space is lit and camera rigged and microphoned. And it may actually seduce people to actually be more confident than they actually are. The other thing that we've noticed throughout the pandemic is, of course, that it is much more difficult in an online world to practice this hesitation that Rachel mentioned earlier. Pauses are awkward at the best of times when we speak to people face to face. We're tempted to jump in with an idea that may not be fully formed, that we may not even fully believe in ourselves. This urge is so much stronger in an environment. So really holding this stillness, finding this moment of hesitation to let this creative friction build and to really leverage that trust is incredibly difficult in an online environment. And then finally, again, as I said, it takes a little bit more effort to organize interactions like this with the kind of people who can offer you the kind of conversation that you need in a specific moment of doubt. We simply can't rely anymore that these will be serendipitously available somewhere in the office or in a workplace as we move in this hybrid phase. So the backstage where we normally practice doubt now looks much more like a front stage. The pause, the hesitation that makes doubt productive is much more difficult to hold. And the people who can help us through those moments of doubt are far more difficult to get hold of.
Thank you, Michael. And Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think the challenge I see with students teaching in a purely online environment is broadcast mode. Right. So how you shift them out of broadcast mode because of the nature of the camera and seeing yourself. And that's where the chat function actually, I think, can be a really powerful space for doubt. People show up, they talk openly and more honestly in chat sometimes than with their video presence because they're not in that broadcast mode. So I think we have the tools to work virtually, but the behaviors that get beyond one type of interaction, we have such a long way to go. In terms of trust and the shifts in working, it's really interesting watching the patterns play out. So when the pandemic first started almost 2 years ago now, many leaders reached out in a complete state of panic as to how they were going to trust their employees working from home. And it was really interesting because I predicted that there would be sort of 3 types of teams and cultures that would play out. The first type of teams and cultures would get stronger. So these were teams that were so dependent on the physical office, lots of meetings, lots of interaction, that actually trust hadn't taken the time to form because the physicality of the office had kept them together. So by working apart and not being able to physically see one another all the time, more trust was able to form. Then you had teams that worked in the other way, where they were dysfunctional to begin with. There was a lot of micromanagement. There was a lot of control, which is often a sign of distrust. And when they were put in a virtual environment, that was completely amplified. And then you had high functioning teams where the transition was completely seamless. Now, what's interesting 2 years on is hybrid working in many ways through a trust lens is a much harder challenge than pure virtual working, because there is judgment around personal choice. There is the tension that people are literally living and working on two different planes. So you may have had this experience that if you are in a meeting, if you're trying to teach, if you're trying to facilitate, or whatever it may be, and you're in the room and people are online, your natural attention and energy goes to those people in the room. So how do you create environments where people don't feel judged? They don't feel like you don't trust them because they have made the decision not to come into the office that day. So this is a real challenge in terms of trust and inclusion when you have people literally operating on two different planes, a physical plane in the room and then a virtual plane online. So I think hybrid working in many ways is more of a trust challenge than virtual working, where people didn't have a choice. That choice was made for them. And here you get into so many areas of judgment and who has responsibility and should it be a policy versus personal choice. It's an extremely complex situation.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, and thank you both. I'm going to start to bring in some questions from the audience. So I've got an eye on the chat that's going on LinkedIn, and can I just thank you? It's so rich. I'm not going to be able to bring in all of it, but if you want to go to that chat, you'll see a lot of really interesting ideas and commentary that people are putting up. But I'm going to take a question from Judy Willits, who asked, why is the self-doubting narrative stronger now? And I want to, in a sense, answer it myself. And I think it's because the need for transformation has got greater. That there's a much greater level of uncertainty about the status quo. And if we continue doing what we've always done, we're going to get the results that we need. And that comes through my podcast series, Leadership 2050, with the people I'm talking to there. So I think, doubt and trust are at the heart of, in a sense, kickstarting a transformation journey. And because there is a much greater demand for transformation on leaders, that's why these things are more important. And that's why those conversations, that space that Rachel, you were talking about needing to be curated is so important. So Michael, could you jump in on this? You and I have been working together on this transformation research. And so how does this give us a deeper insight into this transformation agenda that many leaders are having to deliver?
Yeah, I think absolutely. As leaders lead transformation, they create uncertainty for themselves. They lead themselves and the organization into the unknown. And you yourself have mentioned earlier this need to disconnect from the status quo. You consciously step into the unknown. You consciously step into a world of doubt. At the same time, this world is more turbulent, especially at the moment, than it's been at many points in history before. So both the internal world and the external world is very uncertain, very turbulent, and very loaded with doubt. There is one other aspect, though, that we haven't touched yet on, and to this question about why is the doubt narrative stronger now, and that I think has clearly to do with the rise of the mental health and well-being agenda. Throughout our talk so far, we've touched on words like anxiety, nervousness, fear, and again, speaking from the executive perspective, as the CEOs in the CEO report told us, for them, kind of doubts are for executives, are what nerves are for elite athletes. Like if we can harness them, they give us greater insight, they help us make better decisions. We've been very much focused on the positive performance aspects of doubt. But again, there is always this latent risk that these things do spiral out of control and generate genuine mental health and personal well-being issues, very, very serious medical conditions. And so again, as it has become much more acceptable in the social discourse to open up about our emotions, and especially those that signal more vulnerability, that signal that we're not always at the very top of our game, that has really opened up the space to not just process these doubts, but also, again, to articulate them to others and bring others into them. So I think that's a really, really strong element in this kind of strengthening doubt narrative right now. It is simply more okay now to talk about it.
And Rachel, your work's looked at the cultures of trust and not having a blame culture. And I recall one of the first CEOs I ever worked with who had to lead a massive transformation, did everything they could not to have that blame culture, because they said it was just going to prevent the organization, surfacing the right issues and having the right conversations. Could you just talk more about that and high and low trust cultures, and how would you notice one? What are the signals that you see coming from teams where there is that high trust or low trust?
Yeah, it's a really big and complicated question. So let me try and give a couple of frames. So the first thing I'll say is that distrust and doubt are two very different animals. So we need to come back to that because that's really important. Let's start with the low trust, high trust, Andrew. So low trust doesn't have to be a bad thing. Low trust can simply be a situation where someone doesn't have enough information or experience to make a decision yet. So a low trust environment may just be an early relationship or a team that's just forming. High trust teams, what you tend to see is a lot of autonomy, high disagreement, the ability to disagree, productive conflict, and the ability to tolerate that conflict, empowerment, and macro management versus micromanagement. And the interesting thing is that trust and distrust can coexist. So boards, for instance, you don't want a board that is too trusting. You don't want a board where when anyone says something around the table, everyone believes that that is true, where there is no challenge, where there is no friction. You want enough trust that you're able to distrust one another in a way that leads to productive conflict. So I often find when I ask leaders to sort of visualize the relationship between trust and distrust, they tend to draw a spectrum. So they tend to draw trust on one side and distrust on another side and assume that distrust is a negative. Whereas actually more helpful to think of it as a quadrant, that in healthy organizations, you have high trust and high distrust in certain situations. So trust and distrust can coexist. They don't necessarily sit on a spectrum. Where distrust becomes unhealthy and toxic is when you start to enter what I call this 3D cycle. 3Ds, I should say, not 3D. So the 3Ds are defensiveness, disengagement, and disenchantment. And this is when you know that you've gone into a healthy state of distrust. So if you start with defensiveness, well, all is not lost in defensiveness. Defensiveness is when people are blaming one another. Defensiveness is when there's accusations, when there is judgment. People still care in that stage of defensiveness. The fact that they are blaming one another or they're defending themselves, they are still invested in that situation, in that team, in that relationship. So you can still recover from that place. It's when you start to get to disengagement that you've entered a very dangerous cycle of distrust, because there people are pulling away. They don't feel safe. They're no longer invested. They no longer care. And that leads to disenchantment, where they literally turn away. They turn their backs to the organization, to the team, the culture, and they often become very negative about that situation. So I've said quite a lot there, but I guess a way of summarizing it is distrust and doubt are very different things. You can have high trust and high distrust. And what you want to be looking for is distrust becomes unhealthy, I should say, once you start to get into that 3D 3Ds cycle of defensiveness, disengagement, and then in particular disenchantment.
Yeah, and this really also is coming in on the chat. Donna Herdsman has put a great point. This is not just about leaders, but it's about teams. And as you were both talking, I think two things really resonated with me. One is when you have, well, we need diverse teams. We know that they perform better, but there's something about honoring people and respecting people, which manifests through listening. And through being able to really understand where they're coming from, and holding a space in me that I don't have all the answers, and I value the contribution you're making and what you can bring. So thank you, Donna. That very much aligns with where the conversation's going. If we could take it out now. So I think one of the things which has changed in the context over the last 10 years is social media. And I don't think we should go into a conversation about social media in the world in itself, but to the extent that it plays up or sets a culture for trust and doubt in organizations. And so I know I've got some thoughts on this. So Michael, I'm going to come to you first. Do you think this is having any impact on the culture, on how we are thinking, about how we're behaving, about the assumptions we're making about ourselves, about others? So is social media relevant here at all?
Oh, I think so, very much. And two particular instances immediately spring to my mind, conversations I've recently had. The first one with a good colleague at my college, Green Templeton, Trish Greenhalgh, who's been incredibly active on Twitter throughout the pandemic. She's a healthcare expert. She was very, very involved in a lot of the early pandemic response, especially around face masks, etc. And of course, as academics, we are used to having reams and reams of space to explain our arguments in all their nuance. And when we publish academic papers, there are all the limitations and the boundary conditions, and we can nuance everything we have to say. Now, if you're just having 140 some characters on Twitter, a lot of that nuance is lost. And you actually have to make a much more succinct, naturally statement, which leaves less room for nuance, less room for doubt. So I think social media potentially drives us to making bolder statements. And it's only once you kind of break the boundaries and you publish entire threads on certain topics that you can reintroduce some of that nuance. But of course, then you're very much relying on your readers to pick up on that nuance. It's much more difficult for you to provide it. Second instance, very, very recent conversation in a classroom where someone says, yes, when it comes to this kind of safe backstage space, but what about social media? Everything gets out there much more quickly. Everything gets scrutinized much more quickly. And again, every moment of weakness is or perceived weakness is much more easily kind of latched onto by opponents, by trolls. So again, it becomes more dangerous to publicly doubt yourself. And again, we've recently seen very, very high-profile athletes, for example, who have battled anxiety, you could say self-doubt. Think about Simone Biles in the Tokyo Olympics. Think about other athletes who've withdrawn from the sport, and some people were very, very quick to condemn them. If you can't handle the pressure, then you're just in the wrong profession. And that is, of course, something that is very much facilitated through social media and often also the anonymity around it. So I think the role of social media cannot be overestimated in the way we as humans, as societies and organizations create space for doubt.
Thank you. And Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the context of social media and trust, the relationship between those two things, the problem is really twofold. Speed. So this sounds like a strange thing to say in a world that is so driven by efficiency. But in the context of information, efficiency is the enemy of trust. You want people to slow down. We've seen this in spades in the pandemic, and you want them to say, is this piece of information, is this person, is this news source does it actually deserve my trust? And that's not inherently the way social media is designed. Social media is designed to make it frictionless to share that piece of information. So I'm really interested in this idea of a trust pause. So I've sat in too many meetings between regulators and social media platforms trying to solve problems of misinformation. And interestingly, one of the things that has never come up is, well, how do you slow people down? How do you slow them down so that it's on the user? There's a little bit of friction that maybe a message pops up and says, are you sure that you want to share this piece of information? It does actually come up on Twitter now. You know, if you click on something and you haven't read it, it sort of is a signal that it says something like, you've only read the headline. Are you sure you want to share it? That's a really great example of a trust pause. So the first thing I think is efficiency and speed is a problem when it comes to trust around information. The second thing is context, because trust is highly contextual. So someone or something that you can trust in one context is untrustworthy in another context. And that is something that we often miss or is abused when information is shared through social media, is that it's so easy to extract it and place it in a different context where the meaning or the relevance or the validity of that piece of information changes. So they're the two things that I think are huge challenges that we have to solve, is context and speed, and how that impacts our ability to make good trust decisions. The third, which I'll leave sort of hanging because it's a whole other issue, is it just reaffirms confirmation bias. So the way algorithms work on social media is it becomes easier and easier just to find information that affirms our views versus challenges them and actually causes us maybe to doubt our beliefs in a healthy way, which I think, again, is a really interesting design challenge of how could you actually design for doubt where people would challenge their beliefs in a healthy way and maybe see things through a different lens.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I watched the documentary on Netflix, The Social Dilemma. And I suppose two things disturbed me. One was it was the polls for left and right in US politics, and up to social media going onto mobile phones, they kind of did this. And then as social media goes onto mobile phones, they do that. And you see that point that you're making, the polarization, because if I search for something, the algorithm then gives me more of what I've seen rather than presents different perspectives. Deeply disturbing. And then the other was the suicide of teenagers in the US, which flatlines. Tragic as that is, it just flatlines and it goes up and down until 2009, and then it just takes off. And just listening to some of the executives who developed a lot of the functionality talk about, we just didn't know. We didn't know what the consequence of the like button would be. We didn't know what the consequence of some of the other bits of tech. We thought it would make the world a better place. And, you know, it's arguable in some ways it has, but also it's had these other effects. So thank you, Eduardo, for that. That was your question. So if we could go on, there's quite a few points coming through around imposter syndrome and doubt. And are these the same things? Are they different? Do we need to reframe imposter syndrome in some way? And I think you were talking, Michael, about, you know, I think it was doubt being to an executive what nerves are to an athlete. So Rachel, could I come to you first on this one and just get your perspective on two terms which some people are starting to think of in similar ways, or certainly link, and then psychological safety is something else that's coming through a lot in the chat and questions as well.
Yeah, should we start with imposter syndrome and then I'll be interested in Michael's takes on this. So this isn't my area of expertise. So I'll say personally, I'll talk from my own experience of the difference of experiencing doubt and imposter syndrome. So I feel imposter syndrome in situations where I feel like I don't deserve to be there. I'm questioning my ability. I'm feeling in some way that I don't belong. And whether that's real or whether that's my own personal narrative, it doesn't matter. That's how the feeling rises up, is that I'm going to be found out, or someone's going to see through me, or I don't deserve to be here. That's the narrative. That is very different from the experience of being in doubt, where you're going through this process of almost untangling thoughts, of being very comfortable not knowing something, of being able to sit in the room and deeply listen and question what other people are saying, or whether you maybe got it wrong. There are two very different experiences, and I think they manifest themselves in different ways. So I don't know enough about the psychology of imposter syndrome. I can only talk firsthand that imposter syndrome feels often like an unhealthy internal narrative, whereas doubt, if used in the right way, is incredibly constructive.
That's great, thank you. And Michael?
Yeah, I think just to build on that, again, the way we visualize this landscape of doubt is that there are these kind of peripheral areas where doubts take over, where they do spiral out of control. And that is where we clearly locate imposter syndrome as a consequence of a very peculiar form of doubt. So again, in the power of doubt framework, we map the kind of the IQ dimension between not knowing and knowing, and then a kind of an EQ, emotional dimension between fearlessness and anxiety. And while most executives we work with find it very, very intuitive that, okay, if we don't know, we're likely to feel anxious about the situation. But that is something that is still fairly rational, that we can disentangle, and we can work our way into greater confidence through learning. What is far less intuitive is the quadrant where arguably leaders have sufficient information to make the right decision, and they still feel anxious. So this is where potentially their teams look at them and it's like, you do have all the relevant information at your fingertips. Why do you refuse to press the button? And that is where often we hear leaders say, like, this is the imposter syndrome. One of our CEOs in the CEO report put it very, very nicely. At the point where I have this level of clarity, the next thought that pops into my head is, it can't be that simple. Surely I've missed something. And I find myself all the way back at the not knowing end of things and unraveling all my thoughts again. So this is where imposter syndrome lives, when we do actually have sufficient information to make a decision, but we feel that, again, as Rachel says, we're not trusting ourselves enough to make those kind of big decisions. So imposter syndrome is associated in our framework with the very peculiar situation of doubt, where more information actually leads to greater anxiety.
That's great, and thank you to Amy Young and to Tamsin Jones for those points. I think others have made it as well in the chat, but they had put questions. So we're coming towards the end, and I'd like to ask you both the question, not revealing confidential information here, but who have been the rock stars? Who have been the leaders that have really understood these concepts and implemented them, not just into them, in how they lead, but also built teams around this, built organizations around these things? What have they done? And therefore, what could be takeaways for our listeners in terms of concrete things that they can do differently?
Maybe we can play tennis on this one. So I'll think of one, you think of one, Michael. What do you think of that?
Okay.
Okay. So the first that I think is quite easy to relate to is Gareth Southgate. I think he's a really interesting leader to study in terms of how he's changed the culture of football. And it's fascinating if you look at the headlines after England lost the Euros, it was like full of pride, a country that loves its footballers. That doesn't happen in English football, right? Usually those, I know there was all kinds of terrible issues with the footballers who missed the penalties, but the general media narrative was pride. And if you study Gareth Southgate, he speaks with real humility. He never promises any kinds of outcomes. He often expresses doubt. And it's interesting, there's a wonderful book by Pippa Grange called Fearless. And if you're interested in sports psychology and the role of doubt, I can't recommend it enough. And she was actually the psychologist working with Gareth Southgate and the English football team on helping them really explore their doubts so that they weren't paralyzing, but they could use that fear in a constructive way. So I think Gareth Southgate is a really interesting leader in terms of modeling humility and a healthy relationship with doubt.
Thank you. And a great shout out for a book as well, Rachel. So Michael, over to you. And then Rachel will come back to you and do another round of this.
Okay. Can't wait to hear the next example, and I wonder at what point we actually land on the same candidate. But the person who sprang to my mind, especially in the context of the earlier conversation and question around psychological safety, was Ed Catmull of Pixar. Because what we find in the context of doubt is actually two different kinds of psychological safety that are really important, and he has built a culture of both of those kinds within Pixar. On the one hand, when we doubt and we face this risk of paralysis as decision makers, we need to create the psychological safety for ourselves to be able to say, I don't know, and be able to expect that we will be respected for that. On the other hand, where as leaders, we may be at risk of being overconfident, we need to create psychological safety for those around us to be able to say, you're about to make a terrible mistake. You may want to rethink that and actually inject an artificial dose of doubt into your decision making. And that is something I think if you look at Pixar and the way they go into the development of movies and the way they really conduct their day-to-day business, you can find both of these types of psychological safety written all over the company. So it's a very, very strong kind of doubt-enabling, creativity-enabling culture.
That's great. And then one more from you, Rachel.
Oh, God, just picking one. Well, just because you mentioned the social dilemma, I'll mention an entrepreneur that I spoke to recently, which was Azza Raskin. So I made an episode with Azza for Rethink Moments. And we went back, and Azza, for those of you who don't know, he invented the infinite scroll. So the infinite scroll is what keeps us scrolling on social media on our phones. And the interesting thing is, Azza's dad is Jeff Raskin, who invented the Macintosh. And he invented the infinite scroll to create immersion and focus. And he regrets so deeply how this tool has been hijacked. And he realized for about 10 years of his life, he was completely paralyzed by this guilt. And now what he does is he uses his doubts to try to visualize the potential unintended consequences of the inventions that he creates. And he said that what he's been able to do by really embracing this power of doubt is to move from an entrepreneur that just builds startups to be able to start to see things that will create paradigm shifts in the world, fundamentally change our relationship to time, tempo, or rhythm. So he blew me away in terms of his own realization, in terms of what you can do with doubt and how it can paralyze you or lead you to a completely different space that can unlock incredible creativity.
A fabulous example of someone who's really reflected and changed and actually used that whole process of guilt and regret to actually be fuel for something better and not be stuck in that cycle as you described at the beginning of this session. Fantastic. So I think we're coming towards the end. If there was one takeaway, and I'm going to put myself in here as well. So just one takeaway that you'd like to give to people based on your research, based on your experience, that would act as a summary to this session? So Michael, I'll come to you first and then to Rachel.
I have to put very succinctly, I mean, really what has been my realization through this conversation with Rachel also in preparation for this event is that, again, we have been thinking about doubt as an ingredient rather than the antithesis to confidence. As leaders told us, the better I doubt myself, the more confidence I have in my decision, the more conviction I have in my communication. But it turns out doubt is possibly not just the root ingredient of confidence, but actually also a critical ingredient of trust. And if you can put confidence and trust together, you have a fairly powerful formula for your leadership.
Thank you, Michael. And Rachel?
I would say trust yourself to doubt yourself, because nothing new was discovered in the known.
Say that again for us, because I think that sounded very profound.
Oh, did it? Okay. Trust yourself.
Trust yourself.
To doubt yourself, because nothing new was discovered in the known.
That is a fantastic summary, I think, and so powerful. So I'm going to build off what both of you have said. I think the key takeaway for me is, where do you go to do that? How do you do that? How do you do that as an individual? How do you create that with your team? There's been some conversation in the chat about how meeting agendas are so full. So if you take that principle that Rachel spoke about, if you take what Michael spoke about, and you try and embody it, where do you go? Is it a walk you go to go through that process? Is it that you change your meeting agenda so you have a time where you can all voice doubts, or you can have some kind of mechanism where you can raise doubts? It's so critical, I think, what we're talking about here, to the whole process of leading with humanity, with leading transformation, and of teams and organizations that really can deliver what the world needs. So Rachel, huge thank you to you. Michael, huge thank you to you. It's wonderful to be here with your audiences. With you, the audience. Thank you from wherever you've come from. It's been amazing. And it's great to bring such a global group together in these times. This is one of a number of series we're doing to celebrate the 25 years the business school has been around, but also what do the next 25 years look like. So that brings us to a conclusion. For those of you who are midway through your weekend, I hope you have a fantastic end. And for those of you who are about to start your weekend, I hope that you get some rest and some time for reflection. Thank you.